Today's story begins with a man behind the wheel, driving before the dawn. He had no destination, no plan, and by sunrise his life and the lives of everyone around him would never be the same. But before we get into the weeds of that highly unusual story, welcome to PST. If you love a good tale, the unexplained, forgotten, and the twisted, then you're precisely where you need to be. A new story awaits you here every weekend, so hit like and subscribe now, because this is the only way you'll keep getting the stories no one else dares to tell the way we tell them. Just after 4:30 on a damp Monday morning in 1987, the highways east of Toronto felt hollowed out and echoey, the kind of pre-dawn quiet where the road belongs to truckers, night shift nurses, and the occasional restless soul who couldn't stand being in their own living room 1 minute longer. Sodium lamps threw orange halos across exit signs. In the distance, a gas station flickered to life, a single pump humming to nobody. The sky over Pickering was still black at the top, but a thin, gray seam had opened over the lake. In one of those orange-lit lanes, a dark sedan drifted along at the speed limit. The driver, 23-year-old Kenneth James Parks, was barefoot. He wore jeans and a t-shirt. The radio was off, his hands gripped the wheel in that easy 10-2 position you learn for the test and then forget forever. Except his hands didn't look easy. If you had been beside him for even a second at a red light, if you had glanced over and really seen him, you would have noticed the blood. It threaded along his fingers, pooled in his palms, ran into the shallow channels around the steering wheel controls. The skin over his knuckles looked torn and raw, as if he had punched through glass. At 5:30 a.m., he pulled into a police station in Scarborough. Fluorescent lights buzzed above the lobby. A duty officer behind the desk was halfway through a styrofoam cup of coffee and a crossword. The front door opened and the young man with the shredded hands walked in like he'd been there 100 times, and this was just the next errand on his list. He said quietly, "I think I've killed someone." And then after a pause, as if remembering his manners, "My hands." The officer stared for one of those long expending seconds that feel like a fall. Then he vaulted over the counter, shouted for help, grabbed towels, tried to get the man to sit. The young man complied, blinking, not panicking, not shaking, the way you would expect anyone to shake with that much blood. When asked for names and addresses, he answered plainly as if reciting from a form he'd already filled out. When he looked down at his palms, he did it with almost mild curiosity, as if you would look at the paper cut you didn't even see happen. The address he gave pointed to a tidy low house in Scarborough subdivision of Toronto, Canada, where front yards were rectangles of clipped grass and a morning newspaper landed with a soft plop. Inside that house lived Barbara Ann and Dennis Woods, Kenneth's in-laws. Within minutes, squad cars were racing through empty intersections, siren chopping through the stillness. When the first officers reached the Woods' front step and pushed in, they were met with a scene that would later be described in clinical language: multiple sharp force injuries, ligature marks, signs of struggle. Because it is nearly impossible to describe without softening it somehow. Barbara lay on the bedroom floor. She had been stabbed and strangled. In the hallway and kitchen there were smears and drops and a kind of heavy dark stains that say this happened fast and then kept happening. Dennis was alive, barely, with bruising across his throat and a swelling darkening one side of his face. He had fought. A neighbor, roused by the sirens and the shape of a paramedic in his doorway, would later tell reporters that Dennis had always been the kind of father who went out to fix his fence while the rain was still falling. Stubborn, practical, calm. The name Kenneth Parks was on everyone's tongue by lunch. It should have been a simple case. A man kills his mother-in-law, almost kills his father-in-law, and confesses. But immediately nothing fit. The young man in custody did not match the story the living room seemed to be telling. To understand why this case became a landmark, you have to rewind from that lobby with the fluorescent buzz and the blood. Go back a year. Kenneth was 22, newly married to Karen, and the father of a baby girl, 5 months old, with a solemn stare that babies get when they're about to smile. He had a decent job as a purchasing clerk at an electrical company. On weekends, he changed oil in his car, watched hockey, went out to his in-laws to help with some odd jobs. Friends call him big and soft, 6'5", over 200 pounds, a man whose size made his gentleness feel even bigger. He was the guy who carried the heavy boxes unasked, who apologized when someone bumped into him. But underneath that easygoing surface, something that had been small and manageable had become a problem with gravity. Kenneth had always liked betting. At first, it was a few dollars on the horses with friends, the ritual of pencil on the racing form, the ride home with laughter whether you won or lost. Then it was more dollars and fewer friends. His wife noticed the cash withdrawals and the excuses. He began borrowing, he began hiding. At work, in a tangle of decisions that felt in a moment like a way to fix things, he began siphoning money. Embezzlement sounds like a white-collar crime until you are the one sitting in a manager's office looking at a printout with your name on it and the numbers that don't add up to anything but shame. He was caught, he was fired, he was charged. Sleep, which had always been a door that shut easily for him, stopped closing. He lay awake and measured the dark in breaths. When he did sleep, sometimes he walked standing somewhere else. At the foot of a bed, in a kitchen with his hand on the fridge handle, once on the back step staring at the glow of the neighbor's porch light. As a kid, he did sleepwalk. His parents had laughed about the time he had tried to pour cereal into a shoe. Like a lot of kids, he was supposed to grow out of it, but he never did entirely. Stress brought it back like a weather system. By May 1987, there was finally a plan. He had joined Gamblers Anonymous. He had marked the meeting dates on a calendar on the fridge. He had told Barbara and Dennis he was going to make amends, and they believed him because he was theirs. He had married their daughter, yes, but even before that, he had folded himself into their family with the ease of someone who wants to be there more than he wants to be anywhere else. On the evening of May 23rd, he had dinner with Karen and the baby and fell asleep later than he meant to. Tired in a way that is more than tired, where your thoughts wobble at the edges. Sometime after 4 a.m., he stood up. Here, the story becomes the kind of a thing that forces you to pause because the ordinary verbs refuse to carry the weight. He stood, he walked, he drove. Those are simple actions, the scaffolding of 1,000 mornings, but the story that unfolded after that is one of the vanishingly rare cases where those ordinary actions happened while the part of the brain that says I am awake and choosing was not. He left the house barefoot, keys in hand. He slid behind the wheel and started the car. The route to Woods' home was not complicated. Highway to the next road to the neighborhood turn, but it required dozens of microtransactions. Keep right here, watch the light, brake, accelerate, glance in the mirror, roll the wheel 2 inches to the left, 2 inches to the right. The part of the nervous system that handles such things can do it on autopilot, and it did. When he reached Barbara and Dennis's street, he parked, and with his own key, he let himself in. The house at that hour was the kind of still that amplifies small noises. The click of a thermostat, a hot water pipe knocking. What happened inside in those next minutes is best left to the clean lines of the coroner's report. because the other way to tell it would be to put you in a quiet hallway and ask you to listen, and that would not be fair. What matters for the shape of this story is the aftermath. One person dead, one grievously injured, and the man who caused it driving calmly to a police station and saying he thought he had killed someone, with hands so lacerated that surgeons would later repair severed tendons. Investigators started with the obvious: motive. Motive is the hook you hang a murder on when there is nothing else to keep it from sliding off the wall. In-laws, money, shame, easy pegs. But witnesses, the one who knew Kenneth and Wood's family beyond the headlines, kept giving the same answers in different words. They were close, they loved each other, there had been no shouting matches, no simmering feud, no one-sided Christmases. Dennis and Kenneth watched games together with their feet up. This was not a household held together by politeness. It was held together by affection. Then there was the way Kenneth presented at the station. Officers with decades of experience processing suspects after violent crimes described people shivering so hard the chain on a bench rattled, or talking in a stream that did not stop, because the body's chemical alarms were still blaring. Kenneth, by contrast, was almost level. Not theatrical, not numb exactly, just flat. When hospital staff ran tests, they didn't find the classic stress chemistry spike you'd expect after a fight to the death. And then came the thing no detective likes to hear, but every homicide investigator has to accept sometimes. We can't make the facts fit the story we were expecting. His defense lawyers made a decision that turned this from a grim domestic case into a medical and legal landmark. He argued non-insane automatism, that Kenneth's actions occurred while he was in a state of somnambulism or sleepwalking, and therefore were involuntary. No mens rea, no guilty mind. The law requires intent like a key requires teeth. Without it, the mechanism does not turn. If you're thinking, come on, people sleepwalk to the fridge and wake up with a spoon in a jar of peanut butter, they don't drive across the city, then you are in the good company. Jurors thought the same thing at first. Prosecutors hammered at it. The complexity of a drive, the entry, the sequence of attacks. How could a brain asleep orchestrate a series of actions that would challenge a person fully awake under stress? The courtroom became a crash course in sleep science. Neurologists explained parasomnias, the family of disorders where motor action occurred during non-rapid eye movement sleep, particularly stage 3, sometimes called deep or slow wave sleep. They talked about how in these states the brain can be dissociated, the motor cortex online enough to move, the visual system sampling the environment, but the prefrontal cortex, the seat of planning and conscious control, largely offline. They cited case reports, rare but chilling, people who cooked meals in their sleep, people who climbed out of the windows, people who assaulted partners while dreaming they were fighting off an intruder. They described trigger stacks, sleep deprivation, stress, alcohol, genetic predisposition, how they pile up until the system tips. Kenneth's history mattered here. Family testified to childhood episodes. Found in a hallway, eyes open and glassy, answering to his name but not remembering it in the morning. A teenager discovered on the porch in his socks. An adult who under stress had been shuffling aimlessly at night, opening drawers as if searching for something not in a room. In a sleep lab, under observation, hooked to an EEG that tracked the electrical rhythm of his brain, he had episodes where he sat up, swung his legs over the bed, stood, walked to the door, moved around the room, while tracing on the monitor showed deep sleep pattern. The doctors who ran those tests told the jury that Kenneth's brain was capable of complex motor sequences in a state where his conscious mind would not register them. The prosecution pushed back hard. They brought their own experts who pointed out how rare violence is in sleepwalking. They warned against building a whole defense on a handful of studies and a theory that made the most uncomfortable facts disappear. They reminded the jury of the embezzlement, the pending legal trouble, the shame. They suggested a glancing motive, that Kenneth, overwhelmed, snapped, and his confusion afterward was convenience dressed up as a science. On the stand, Kenneth was not slick. He did not thread alibis through his answers. He said over and over in slightly different words that he did not remember. He remembered going to bed. He remembered flashes, the feeling of a steering wheel, a sense of moving through a tunnel of light, the bloom of pain where he looked down at his hands in the station. His wife testified that he loved her parents and that there had been no fights. Dennis, who survived, did not tell a revenge story. He said he had no memory of the moment he was attacked and that he had never been afraid of his son-in-law. There was nothing for the prosecution to hook a "he hated them" narrative onto. After weeks of testimony, the jury went out. They came back with a verdict that still ripples through criminal law syllabi. Not guilty of murder, not guilty of attempted murder. The judge instructed them on automatism, and they accepted that at the time of the acts, Kenneth's mind was not present in a way the law requires for criminal responsibility. He walked out of the court, legally innocent, and morally tied forever to something that will never be simple or light. The reaction outside was messy, as reactions are when the law does something that looks like letting a killer go. There were headlines about a sleepwalking defense that made it sound like fiction. There were talk radio callers who compared it to blaming the weather. There were families who cut out the story and stuck it to the fridge as a version of "you never know." And there were sleep specialists quietly relieved that their field had been heard in a courtroom without being turned into a sideshow. If this is where the story ended, with a verdict and a tidy coda about science and law, you could breathe. But people are not law school hypotheticals. After the trial, Kenneth and Karen's marriage did not survive the weight of grief and public attention. In the years that followed, he struggled with depression, with the ordinary humiliations of being recognized in the grocery store for the worst day of his life, with new legal trouble unrelated to that morning that kept his name in print in ways that made it impossible to build something steady. For the Woods family, the shape of the story never changed. Barbara was gone. Dennis had lived. For the doctors who testified, the case became a reference point when patients' families came in frightened by what someone had done at night. For lawyers, it became a citation, R.V. Parks. A case you pull down when you need to explain why acts done in a state of automatism may attract no criminal liability. And then you set it back on a shelf with hands you don't quite realize are trembling because you have just spent an afternoon reminding yourself that sometimes we move with our eyes open while the part of our brains that means to be good is still asleep. Was every neuron of Kenneth's prefrontal cortex offline in that house? No human instrument can tell you that. Is homicidal somnambulism rare? Extremely. Are human beings capable of doing things with their bodies at night that their waking selves would never choose? Absolutely. Do courts have to decide anyway? Every day. Thank you for watching today's post-scriptum tale. If you made it this far, you know the line between ordinary life and unimaginable horror can be thinner than anyone realizes. A new story will be waiting for you here next weekend, so hit like and subscribe now, because this is the only way you'll keep getting the stories no one else dares to tell the way we tell them. See you next time.